Good morning and welcome to the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known. It is Friday, February 4th, 2022. Cultural appropriation is nothing new. For years, prominent white people have been accused of borrowing the fashions, music, and art forms of various cultural groups and popularizing them as their own. The music industry has been particularly hard hit by this practice. The 1991 film, The Five Heartbeats, for example, which was based on the experiences of real Black bands, depicts how music executives took the works of Black musicians and repackaged them as the product of white artists. Due to cultural appropriation, Elvis Presley is widely regarded as being the king of rock and roll, despite the fact that his music was heavily influenced by Black artists who never received credit for their contributions to the art form. In the early 1990s, white rapper Vanilla Ice topped the Billboard music charts when rappers as a whole remained on the fringes of popular culture. We explore how musicians with wide appeal today, such as Madonna, Gwen Stefani, Miley Cyrus, and others, have been accused of cultural appropriation, borrowing heavily from Black, Native American, and Asian traditions. We discussed with Dr. Mia Moody-Ramirez, a professor and chair at Baylor University's College of Arts and Science and the Department of Journalism, Public Relations, and New Media. Also, Dr. Riché, Richardson, professor of Africana Studies at Cornell University, Patrick Washington, the publisher of the Dallas Weekly, and his wife Jessica, and of course, James Wright of the Washington Informer and Let It Be Known's contributor will join us as well. But first, let's bring on the president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis Jr. And of course, we'll bring in James Wright at this moment. Good morning, Dr. Chavis.
Good morning to you, Stacey, and good morning to James Wright.
Good morning.
Friday, where the Black press is on point. And on behalf of all of the 230 African-American owned newspapers and media companies across the country representing the NNPA, we're very pleased to be on this segment of Let It Be Known.
Absolutely. And Dr. Chavis and James, in the news this morning to start our day, Michelle Obama. The 2024 presidential election campaign is already in full swing, particularly on the Republican side with two Make America Great Again titans, Donald Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, already engaging in campaign trail-like wars of words. At this point, it's a given that they will be 1 and 2 in the GOP field. But what about Democrats? While President Biden has strongly indicated he'll seek a second term, there's been lots of internal talk inside the Democratic Party about a quote-unquote emergency candidate whom the party has identified as none other than Michelle Obama. Now, the former First Lady has said she has no desire to run, but Democrats are nervous, and members of both parties have identified Michelle Obama as the only quote-unquote unbeatable candidate. One Republican senator said yesterday when asked about Michelle Obama, he said, I quote, "Oh God," he says, "she cannot be beaten. She's far too popular, and neither Trump nor DeSantis has neither the war chest nor the wits to stand up against her." This, of course, bears watching. We know that President Biden has already stated that he intends to seek a second term, but there is, Dr. Chavis and James, internal discussions within the Democratic Party about the quote-unquote emergency candidate who everyone identifies as Michelle Obama.
Well, you know, I think the Democrats better be careful of the seeds that are planted among them to get them to start bickering. They can't be thinking about 2024 right now. They better be thinking about 2022. That should be the focus this year. You know, they should not prepare themselves to lose the House and to lose the Senate, because if they lose the House and lose the Senate, then they will lose the House in 2024, no matter who the candidate is. So I think it's misplaced bickering among the Democrats. They should focus. Joe Biden is keeping his promise to Black America. He's putting a Black woman on the Supreme Court. I don't know what do we have to do to allow ourselves not to be susceptible to the tricks and the hoodwink and the okey-dokes that keep getting thrown our way.
Yeah, and James, I know that you had some thoughts on Michelle Obama, but let's just say this: She has repeatedly said she has no interest. She says she will help with fundraising, she will help with campaigning, but she has no interest in the office. And some say, well, this will afford Barack Obama, who everyone seems to miss, a third term.
Well, I don't know about all about that. I agree with Dr. Chavis. The Democrats really need to focus on keeping the House and keeping the Senate. Stacey, I don't want to date myself, but I remember in the late 1970s when there was talk about Ted Kennedy running against Jimmy Carter in the primaries in 1980. And Ted Kennedy was supposed to be able to waltz into the White House, and he was supposed to be able to waltz into the Democratic nomination. But we all know what happened with that. His candidacy floundered. And so we have to be careful about putting Michelle Obama on that type of pedestal. Yeah. I agree with some of the sentiments you echoed. She's good with fundraising. She's good with public speaking, but she does not need to be a candidate.
And let's make it clear.
I predict that Michelle Obama is going to campaign for the re-election of Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, without question.
What we should be thinking about is 2028, 2026, when Biden finishes his second term. Will the United States of America elect its first woman president? That's what people should be talking about.
Right, and just to conclude this topic, James, the difference between Ted Kennedy and Michelle Obama. Ted Kennedy had a lot of baggage. Let's face it. Michelle has absolutely no baggage. But again, like Dr. Chavis said, we'll see what happens, not in 2024, but certainly in 2022, and then later in 2028. Also in the news this morning, 4 men have been arrested for allegedly being part of a drug trafficking organization that sold deadly fentanyl-laced heroin to actor and producer Michael K. Williams, according to a press release from the United States Attorney's Office of the Southern District of New York. Michael K. Williams, best known for his roles as Omar Little on HBO's The Wire, was found dead in September 2021 at his New York City apartment. The New York City Medical Examiner's Office later determined Williams died from an accidental overdose. Irvin Cartagena, who's 39 years old, Hector Robles, 57, Louis Cruz, 56, and Carlos Mackey, 70, were arrested and were charged. Each were charged with conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to distribute fentanyl. So, it's such a tragedy when we lose anyone. And then when someone like Michael K. Williams, who had so much more to give, even prosecutors pay attention to that.
Well, fentanyl is such an issue here in Washington, D.C. If you go in the streets, and I spend a lot of time out in the streets, it's quite popular among those who are addicted to it. And I'm not saying, let me just say this, it's not just 1 or 2 people, but a lot of people are dealing with that. But it's time for our government officials to acknowledge fentanyl for what it is. They need to come up with policies in order to fight it, to educate people about it, because this is really a serious problem, a very serious problem.
It is, and it's a deadly problem. And it's not just one community; it's everybody, James. So it's something that it should be looked at, federally, locally, and certainly within communities, because it is a serious issue. And we will continue to bring this type of information to the Black press, our viewership, our readership, and continue to highlight it. Today, we're talking about cultural appropriation. And we know that it's nothing new. So joining us now are Dr. Mia Moody-Ramirez, a professor and chair at Baylor University's College of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Journalism, Public Relations, and New Media. She does everything, y'all. And Dr. Riché Richardson, professor of Africana Studies at Cornell University. Good morning, professors.
Good morning.
So we are so thrilled to have you. But let's get into this. We saw. One of the things that triggered this particular episode of Let It Be Known, we were watching a video of Madonna along with Kanye West and Demi Lovato and others, and many may have seen this video. It was widely circulated recently on social media. And some of the comments on that video, a lot of the comments, is why is Madonna, quote unquote, trying to act or be Black? We saw her with cornrows before last year, and that caused a firestorm. We also saw Madonna, and this is not just about Madonna, but just as an example, Madonna adopted kids from Africa, but we saw her post something very disturbing on social media a couple of years ago when she referred to one of her young sons playfully, but still very, very scary, as that little N-word. What's going on here? We'll let our professors who are experts in this take over. Professor Richardson, Professor Ramirez, give it to us.
Oh, thanks so much for the invitation to come on this morning. And I want to just send up birthday wishings and blessings to Rosa Parks, who's dear to so many, and just so well remembered and honored as the first, the mother of the civil rights movement. I am in total agreement that these issues are very problematic, and they've had a very long history. We're in a culture rooted in slavery, imperialism, and those mechanisms tend to catalyze and sustain power relations and appropriations of work related to people of color, including people of African descent. And so the dynamic is very extractive, and capitalism fuels those dynamics. And so I'm seriously concerned. And when you have those appropriations and redirections of Black cultural material, what happens is that they're taken without any consideration for the origins and the experiences that are attached to them. And worse, the market values that are attached to the appropriations do not extend to people of African descent to benefit in any way from their creations. And so it's not just popular music that has produced such issues. It's also social media these days. I remember a few months ago hearing about the issues with TikTok performers, Black performers who were having their dance moves appropriated by white influencers, and were not being compensated properly. So it's a very big problem.
Yeah, and Dr. Ramirez, some have said, this is blackface in reverse.
It has been called blackface in reverse, and the studies of cultural appropriation have actually shifted because it is changing. And as you alluded to earlier, so previously they focused on maybe wearing the types of clothing that individuals wore, but now they're actually focusing on mannerisms, vernacular, sassiness of Black women. So what we're seeing now, as was mentioned previously, on TikTok, you have individuals who are appropriating Black culture. And when Black people do it, they're framed as being framed negatively as being, quote unquote, ghetto. However, when white people do this, it can actually elevate their careers. They become influencers. They're able to make a lot of money doing it. And so that's the issue, because they're able to adopt our things. And it goes back to what you said earlier, like with some of the earlier artists who Elvis, some of those others, it's very similar. You can't really draw a direct connection, but it's still the same, because they are making money as influencers. They make a lot of money on TikTok and on Instagram by adopting some of the culture of Black people. They don't give attribution when they steal their dance moves. They don't say, well, I got this from so-and-so who is a famous choreographer. They don't give credit where credit is due. And so, yeah, it has continued to be an issue. And people originally didn't really know about it because it wasn't talked about in the news cycle, but now it is actually talked about in the news cycle. People are aware of it. They know that it's wrong. So really, there's no excuse.
Yeah, and it's you made a great point. Of course, in some sense, it's almost like they're making fun of us, but really, the underlying thing is they're making a lot of money off of our off of us, right?
Yes, and that is a component of cultural appropriation. So it's not only adopting or stealing these elements, but it's also profiting from doing these things. And so if I act sassy and a certain way as a Black woman, I might get labeled as the angry Black woman. But you have these individuals who are doing the same thing. They're making these short videos on and they're posting them on Instagram, posting them on TikTok, and they get a lot of likes, they get a lot of shares, and all they're simply doing is behaving like a Black woman. But they're able to escalate, they're able to create a career out of it. And so that's why people have a problem, because they are profiting from the Black culture.
Yeah, and again, we talked about the music industry and how it's really, really very blatant in the music industry. We talked earlier about the film The Five Heartbeats, which really exposed a lot of that. But one of the things that struck me, even when I was younger, obviously I was younger when Vanilla Ice hit the scene. We had a lot of hip hop artists that really, really earned their stripes, if you will. And then you had this guy come along, and all of a sudden, he's got hit records on what sounded like parody.
I think that's exactly right. Going back to the topic of the frozen few that we were talking about earlier with Mr. Wright, it also is deeply disrespectful in some ways to the legacy of Alpha Phi Alpha. So I always found that to be very concerning. The Godfather of Soul even registers these issues in his just iconic and classic song, I'm Real, where he underscored, he was the real Superbad, invented soul, and there's nobody out there good enough to take the things he has. And so he was very frustrated by all of those appropriations, and that tune pushed back against them in a very compelling way. I first heard of this problem in my life during my childhood in the 1970s, when Bo Derek famously wore braids. And one of the issues, I mean, I knew nothing about the film 10 and the context for that, but I remember my mom and some other relatives talking about it, the fact that she wore braids and was being given credit for basically inventing them. And what did that mean? And so the other issue is beauty standards, the impact on beauty standards, features that are often derided in relation to Black bodies become celebrated when attached to whiteness. And all of that in certain ways sends the message that Blackness doesn't matter. I look at Beyonce's Coachella performance and Homecoming and her celebration of historically Black marching bands, and then how Taylor Swift seemingly appropriated some of those motifs, but then entirely emptied of any groundings in African American culture in the ways that Beyonce anchored them. Stepping is a tradition similarly associated with Black college experience, and yet and still it's been globalized as a form and genre, and we can applaud the fact that it has been and celebrate it, but then the question becomes, well, what actually is coming back to HBCUs? And that's frustrating in so many ways.
Yeah, and let's before we continue the discussion, let's bring on Patrick Washington, the publisher of the Dallas Weekly. Patrick, thanks for joining us.
Hello, all.
Hi, Patrick.
Everybody hear me?
Good morning.
Yes, we can hear you, Patrick. And Patrick, we are talking, of course, cultural appropriation. Dr. Chambers, I know you wanted to weigh in. I see you chomping at the bit. So go ahead, Doc.
Well, first I want to thank Professor Richardson for her scholarship and her foresight, as well as her insight, and also Professor Moody-Ramirez for your leadership. And always glad to see Patrick and Brother James. I see this, I'm looking at this globally. First of all, white supremacy is on the decline. And the reaction to the decline of white supremacy is not only cultural appropriation, but, I think that at some point, if there's ever a saturation of cultural appropriation, you're going to have cultural transformation. You have now the browning of America. Let's just take the United States of America. What's happening with all the reason why you have all this voter suppression? Because more and more Black people, more and more Latino people, more and more communities of color have the power to change these communities if they vote. That's why they're trying to stop them from voting. This is also connected to culture, the music, the art form, how we define beauty, as Professor Richardson has noted. All of this is changing. The question is now, how does this also monetize? How does this also serve to empower our community, or does it serve to further deplete our community? You look at the gentrification that's going on. Black communities that once were solid communities in the urban centers have now been taken over. That's not cultural appropriation. That's cultural takeover. That's cultural depletion. That's cultural removal. So there's a struggle here that I think that we in the Black press, and I'm glad you're noting this, Stacey, that we need to be aware of. But we should also have our own point of view. Where is this heading? How can we turn this into our own interests, political interests, cultural interests, economic interests, social interests, intellectual interests? That's why this whole debate about critical race theory is, why is this happening now? You know, I think all these things are timed because despite what people think of the power of Donald Trump, his kind of thinking, his kind of image is on the decline. White supremacy is on the decline. There's some people that want to fight the Civil War again. They want to raise up the Confederate flag again. All these things, all these symbols. Some even want to raise the Nazi flag again. So I think that all of what we're discussing should be in its current day historical context. This is the 4th day of Black History Month, 2022. What does this mean to us today? And what does this mean to us for our future? To me, that's how we should be dealing with these issues. So we're just not reacting to what we think is the negative, but I want to project a positive that comes from our very being, our very resilience as a people who've had to confine and confront these issues for centuries, not just months, not just years, but for centuries.
And Doc, I appreciate that commentary, of course. Patrick, you're Patrick come lately, so we got to get you to jump in on this. But I wanted to throw this question to you, Patrick, as well as to our professors, asked by David Youngblood. He says, how do we limit cultural appropriation?
Well, one thing is control. You first have to understand that for Black folk, culture is the only thing that I think we've been allowed to sell. You know, if you look at the history of us here, we started off as commodities, if you will. So everything about us is, in my opinion, in sort of a metaphoric sense by the United States, is looked at as owned. So I'll take jazz, for example. Jazz was this, you know, the Negro, you know, stuff that they were doing until some French person said it was cool. And then all of a sudden it's an American art, you know, and we've been having that same complaint for what, 100 years? You know, I heard you mention Vanilla Ice. You know, it's like we tend to not understand how to control our own culture. And things like TikTok prove that. You know, young Black kids are creating dances and trends, and then the young white kids recreate them poorly and get paid by corporate America. So there has to be an understanding of control and an appreciation of the culture. I think that sometimes we have a little bit of lack of understanding of what our culture actually is. We sort of look at it as the outward expression of who we are, when it could be all of what we are, how we identify ourselves in a country that didn't give us an identity. And so the Black press is a perfect example of control. You want to control the narrative, you have to own the means of creating the narrative, of pushing out the narrative, of marketing the narrative. And that goes into all aspects of our community. And then when it comes to culture, it's art, music, dance, theater, language, food, fashion. You know, we should first understand that all cultures from the United States have in part been ours. I don't care what it is. We didn't maybe not have had the entirety of, you know, the culinary arts in America or the, you know, literary arts, but our contributions create part of the foundations, and we have to understand that first. Then you can understand how to control it in institutions, in corporations, in businesses, nonprofits. However the thing is produced, you have to be the thing producing it. And you're never going to be able to, you know, stop somebody from, you know, taking your braids or locking their hair or using certain slang, but you can create a sense in the broader excuse me, the broader community that this comes from somewhere. Everyone eats pizza, but everybody will tell you it's Italian. Lots of kids do Taekwondo and they'll all tell you it's Korean. But when somebody's spitting a rap, they're just having fun. They're just doing their thing. That's the problem. You know, you need to understand that we have lost a little bit of control in our ability, in our need to be seen, trying to get out there, and we can have countless examples of that. I mean, all the way back to, you know, Bojangles trying to, you know, do blackface just to do, you know, theater. You know, it's like we need to stop doing that and start to put more emphasis on the control of all of our aspects of our culture and community. That's a long-winded way of saying, you know, let's get our stuff and own it.
Yeah, and Professor Ramirez and Professor Richardson, want to throw it to you on this. We have to, as Patrick said, we have to control our own narrative. But again, what do we do otherwise to try and get control of this? Oh, Professor Ramirez, you're on mute.
I think it's a two-pronged approach. First, I know that you all talked about right now, it feels like people are just identifying it. That's actually part of the process. First, you identify it. Once it's identified, then you can call it out. Then you can also offer tips about how to change it. But that's actually, like, if you look back at history, that's always the first step, is you have to, you know, call these things out and let people know that it's wrong. Because some people are where they shouldn't be naive, maybe they are naive. So that is actually the first step, is documenting it. And as researchers, we are documenting. I'm actually working on a paper right now about cultural appropriation and looking at memes in cultural appropriation. So that's one of the important steps. And within those articles, we can offer tips and advise people on how to handle cultural appropriation and tell them some things that you can do. If you want to copy somebody's work, you need to acknowledge them. If you're making money from a certain community, you need to give money back to that community. You need to give jobs to individuals from those communities. So you need to offer them some tips, but identifying it is the first step. And then you can go from there, and then you can take on some of these other steps.
Professor Richardson, Patrick talked about blackface, right? Going back to early Hollywood, or you know, mid-century Hollywood, and I know it was mentioned earlier about Bo Derek and how, you know, people said she, you know, gave her credit for the braids, which was, you know, absurd. We have to fully embrace it, our productive culture. And that does include art, right? It includes medicine, architecture, engineering, etc. As John, he says his name is John Shaft. I like that. John Shaft says.
Well, I so agree that it is important to call out these dynamics and problems and to insist on accountability. When I was listening to the Republican National Convention a few years ago, it was astonishing that First Lady Melania Trump apparently extracted literal passages from a speech previously given by Michelle Obama. You know, these dynamics are very unacceptable. So calling it out is important. I know many people who come from a time, who remember a time when you said color on TV. And that was a reflection of our marginalization in the media and in our exclusion. And so we have to remember that we've had limited access to these platforms over time. And what does it mean when people appropriate and displace Blacks from the mainstream? And when that happens, we lose, they lose, and then they don't learn. And so I think that has to change. Another thing is that it's important to think about the productive aspects, like what can we gain? I think of the Million Man March, which I know Dr. Chavis was very much focused on spearheading. It was interesting that actually had iterations in the public sphere, in the Million Woman March, the Million Mom March, the Million Youth March. And so that's a good example maybe of certain forms of cultural appropriation, but people need to understand what allyship means and the importance of practicing it in very responsible ways.
Oh, I think you bring up an amazingly good point, allyship. And you know, before I go to James Washington, I want to go back to you on that, Dr. Ramirez. Could you piggyback off that, how important that is?
Yeah, allyship is very important, because throughout history, we have had allies from different backgrounds who have stepped in and who are not afraid to speak up for minority communities and for Black communities in particular. But allies can help pave the way, because some individuals will not listen to people from marginalized groups, but they will listen to those allies. And so they can actually serve as kind of a mediator. And it's unfortunate that you, in this day and age, you still need that, but it is the truth. So those allies can actually help make change.
Yeah, and James, I want to lift up something Bobby Henry said, is writing. He says, if it is true that imitation is the greatest form of flattery, then what is that telling us about us? There's nothing wrong with us. We just give ours away.
And
You're on mute, James. You're muted, James.
I'm getting real excited. Let me just say that we are a talented and gifted people. We have always been a talented and gifted people going back into ancient history. It is Black people who have defined ancient history during the ancient world, and we're defining things now. And it is just as the doctors have said, and Patrick alluded to it, and Dr. Chavis definitely honed on it. We need to cash in on it. Look, I remember the Bo Derek thing. And the funny thing about Bo Derek is that the day after she came out with that, her quote, cornrows, there was a cartoon, Peanuts, where Peppermint Patty changed her hairdo to cornrows, saying that this is the new style. So we have to learn how to profit off of our own great accomplishments in the arts, as well as a variety of a lot of fields. People just can't imitate us anymore and not get paid for it.
Yeah. And Patrick, I want you to also weigh in on that, because we're talking about being copied, right? And David Youngblood says is cultural appropriation actually part of the reason some of our culture has survived?
that's a good point. And I've actually probably not thought about it in that way, but that's a good point. And the recognition, I think everybody's kind of circling around the same point, is I think that the recognition is what we're looking at right now. And the braids thing, that's secular too. Like, I think about a few years ago, one of the Kardashians put braids in their hair, and then like the fashion world blew up, like, oh my God, they've done something so amazing. And luckily right now we have social media, which is its own double-edged sword. But almost immediately, as the professors have been saying, it was called out. It was called out, it was shamed, it was hashtagged, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, y'all know now. So I think we're just circling around the same issues. Like, we need control, but I think it was said earlier, there's allyship in this. Just because, like I said, everybody eats pizza. Everybody likes taekwondo. There's certain things we've sort of seen as culturally relevant globally. Even things like, right now, African music is becoming a popular genre. You know what I mean? And so and people imitate it in their pop culture. And I think, but the thing is, which I will say I've noticed, even when it comes to African identity, that is more respected in a global sense. Not like on par with Europeans or anything, but when you say Black, people almost lump that into the American lexicon. It's like, oh, that's American. And but it's not like Afropop, which is now a theme in pop music. Hip hop doesn't even get mentioned in, when it's turned into pop music. It's now pop music. Yeah. And so I think the allyship has to come in that aspect, where it's like, okay, well, if you're going to do something that is culturally Black, or specifically in from our community, someone has to say that's that. And we've had some folk do that. I'm not going to say every single person who imitates is taking. And I think a good example that's a debate online right now is Bruno Mars. If you've ever heard him and Anderson .Paak are doing a lot of funk and soul music, and he's being criticized because he's not, identifiably Black. And he said, like, I listen to the Stevie Wonders, I listen to the Marvin Gayes, I listen to the people who I'm imitating in order to get like them. And he said that publicly. He's running around with a bunch of Black people doing the same music, celebrating the culture, and he's not backing down from it, which I respect. I also get the criticism. Yeah. But I think that's where it starts. Someone has to say, that's ours, we created it, and someone has to say, they're right, and I'm using it. So it's a two-way street, in my opinion.
Well, Robin Thicke imitated, copied Marvin Gaye, and fortunately, he had to pay for it. So that was a good part of this appropriation. I want to give Doc his closing thoughts, and then I want to make sure to give our two distinguished professors the last word on this. Dr. Chavis?
Well, again, I'm just smiling. This fourth day of Black History Month 2022. I think this is a great discussion. And we probably need a program, Stacey, just on allyship. I just want us to remember part of the importance of history, you learn from it, not necessarily to repeat it, but to learn from it. And I can tell you without fear of contradiction, if it were not for the Soviet Union, if it were not for China, there would have been no African liberation because and decolonization against imperialism in Africa, because the United States and Europe were on the wrong side of history. Even when, by the time Reagan became president, everybody celebrates Ronald Reagan, but people don't know. The Reagan administration opposed dismantling apartheid. They opposed Martin Luther King's birthday. They opposed Mandela from being released from prison. So I think allyship is very important. We need to know who our allies are. And something that Patrick said, we have to control, you can't control what you don't own. We have to own our media. And therefore, if we own our media, we control the narrative that's transmitted and distributed by media. And we have to know how to identify who's a real ally and how to identify who's the enemy. And these things change, over a period of time, as we change, as we adapt, as we move forward. So I think this is a very healthy discussion. We need to continue it, but we also need to press forward. I keep saying 2022, we cannot allow these white supremacists to retake our communities, to retake our right to vote, to retake our right to breathe, to retake our right to drive, to retake our right to jog, to retake our right to live.
Well, thanks, Dr. Chavis. Dr. Richardson, your final thought on this topic this morning as we close out.
Well, I can only say that it's best not to forget a message from the late, great Greg Tate, who famously talked about what it means to take on everything but the burden. And so if you take on the culture, you need to be willing to take on the burdens that are attached to it. And yes, to practice allyship in ways that go beyond the egregious forms of performance allyship. I think of Barbara Christian, another phenomenal Black intellectual who talked about what is at stake in being willing to take our texts, but not our bodies, in terms of excluding and alienating our bodies. And so there's a paradox built into this dynamic as well, where the culture is extracted, the culture is appropriated, and there's profiteering, but there's no concomitant investment in actually helping to ameliorate the struggles associated with that culture. And so I think that if one does one, it's important to also do the other and to problematize even any investments in wanting to appropriate a culture and to erase it. And understanding, I think it's important to understand the deep racial and racist implications of that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richardson. Dr. Ramirez, your closing thought. And yes, you're on mute.
I have some tips to offer, because many times people pretend like, well, I just don't know. How do you know? Well, here are some questions that you can ask. Does the culture you're imitating have a history in oppression? Are you benefiting financially from borrowing from the culture? And are you able to remove something when you get tired of it and return to a privileged culture when others can't? So those are some of the things that you can ask if you're confused, if you think, well, am I actually appropriating? And if you can respond yes to those, then yes, it is a cultural appropriation.
Well, Dr. Ramirez, thank you so much. Patrick Washington of the Dallas Weekly, your last thoughts. We got about 30 seconds.
People, let's own our stuff and make sure we control it. 30 seconds.
Thank you so much. And somebody said it earlier. Look, say it loud. James, y'all mentioned James Brown, right? I'm Black,
Black and I'm proud.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for joining us on Let It Be Known. Have a great week, and everyone stay safe. Wear a mask. Get vaccinated if you can. And everybody, let's get out of this pandemic. We'll see you on Monday.